Well, good morning. My name is Derek Hanna. I'm recording this talk just a few days before your conference. There's only one internet line in and out of Queensland where I'm living at the moment, and so we have to share it, so I'm doing it, so there are no technical hitches on the day for you. Just to put my credentials on the table as we start, and you can judge me as to where the scales fall with this. I live in Brisbane, where I worked and I planted a Presbyterian church many years ago now. I'm part of, as you can see me around me here, of a revitalisation, a Presbyterian church in the inner city of Brisbane. But I'm here today in my capacity as the person who leads Geneva Push, which is the planting arm of Reach Australia. Reach Australia is a network that exists to see thousands of healthy, multiplying evangelistic churches across Australia, both plants and established churches. Since about 2009, Geneva Push has had the vision of seeing hundreds of churches evangelised into existence across Australia, of which we've already seen over 110 churches launched in the past 10 years, and we are now planning and praying for the next 200 by 2030 under God. But we know that even getting to that point, we would have only just scratched the surface about what needs to happen in order to reach millions of people in Australia who don't have a viable witness of the gospel where they are. And so over the past few years, we've been working as well with helping established churches regain the mission for which they were originally planted. And so about 2 years ago, Reach Australia was born, of which Geneva Push is a planting arm. Now, I've been asked today to talk on this question of, do I have what it takes? Do I have not what it takes? I want to start this morning by just looking quickly at 2 Timothy chapter 1, which I've been reflecting on recently. Paul is writing to Timothy here in 2 Timothy 1. As you all know, you're all Bible scholars, Paul's at the end of his life. It's probably around 64, 65 AD. He's writing from some obscure prison in Rome where it's hard to find. You find in chapter 1, verse 17, his friends found it hard to find him. He was chained like a criminal in 1:16 and 2:9. He's been isolated and deserted by people in chapter 4:16. And his expectation as he writes this is that this is his last will and testament. He's going to die in prison. And in the wider church context of the time, things were grim, challenging to say the least. Nero was reigning. And after the Great Fire in 64 AD, he had begun extensively torturing and executing Christians. And this fledgling movement called the Church of Christ had only had about 30 years or so to establish itself, and it now saw one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen seeking to wipe it out. And its greatest advocate and greatest church planner and the greatest evangelist was rotting in prison. And the question now, after what must have seemed to many Christians like the golden age of growth here, is what next? Who next? Who will be entrusted with the message of the gospel and the growth of the church and the expansion of the church when Paul is gone? And it's into that context that Paul writes to Timothy. Now, you know, Timothy was deeply loved by Paul. 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says that. He's a co-worker of Paul, Romans 16. And Paul says in Philippians that he has no one else like Timothy. No one like Timothy. He loves him. But Timothy was also young. 1 Timothy 4, Paul says that. He seemed a little bit fragile. You get that little comment in 1 Timothy 5 where Paul says to take a little tonic for your upset stomach. He seems timid as well. When Paul writes to the Corinthians, he tells them not to treat Timothy with contempt in 1 Corinthians 16. So this Timothy figure seems like a gentle, young soul with some health issues who is going to take over from the herald and the apostle, Paul says in 2 Timothy 1, and the teacher who under God had seen the gospel spread across the entire Roman Empire. But there's no resignation in Paul as he writes to Timothy. No thought of, I wish I could have found someone better, more competent, someone who would really take it to the next level, someone with a little bit more charisma. And Paul writes with the confidence that what will happen next in the church and throughout the whole Roman Empire is not shaped by the messenger themselves, but by the message and the one that message is about. And that's where he goes in 2 Timothy, what he says. You have a look from verse 6. And just very quickly, we'll move through this. He says, don't be ashamed of me or the gospel, but come join with me in my suffering. Doesn't seem very glorious, does it, for Timothy? And he says, if you keep reading there, because God has called us by his grace. What kind of grace? It is sovereign grace. He called us not because of things we had done, but because of his own grace. It's sovereign grace. And it's pre-existent grace. This grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. And it's visible grace. This grace has a face. It is located in a person, and that person is Jesus. And Paul's confidence, as you read, keep reading here, particularly in verse 12 here, is not located in an idea. See what he says there? Verse 12, I'm suffering, I'm in jail because I'm a herald, but it's no cause for shame because I know whom I have believed. It's interesting there. I expect him to say, I know what I've believed, but he doesn't say that. He says, I know whom I have believed in God himself, in human form, Saviour and King. Now, with that background, here's the challenge I have with the question I've been asked to speak on. Do I have what it takes? Because look, it's a provocative question. It's meant to be a provocative question. I think that's the purpose of it. But how that question is interpreted significantly relies on the hearer themselves. It can go in any number of ways, because it could be precisely the wrong question to ask, or it could be precisely the right question to ask. Now, let me start over here. Here's why it could be precisely the wrong question to ask. Because if taken at face value, it could play into an unhelpful and misleading caricature of church planners, which is too common. Too common. You know the picture of the typical church planner that's so prevalent so often. I hardly need to describe it. In fact, in the recent podcast, which I don't really even need to name, that's doing its rounds everywhere, about one particular church plant and one particular church planner, that is probably what comes to mind when we think about church planners. Young, highly charismatic, entrepreneurial, opportunistic, inner city, hipster, they all have a story beginning with a garage and a wife and a dog. Every one of them has that story. Now, I think we all know. That that's a caricature. But the reality of that picture echoes large in many people's minds. Now, I planned a church, but the only thing in that list that describes me is that I have a wife and I have a dog, and once I had a meeting in a garage. But this picture echoes and is lodged in people's minds about what a church planner is, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous for two reasons. It's dangerous because some might be attracted to that picture. And this caricature can easily play into the sinful, self-indulgent, narcissistic opportunities that a church planting context can create. In the early days of a church plant, the cement is very, very wet. Yes, people bring their baggage when they join, but there's no history to the church. You can do anything at that point, and the person leading it, even with a plurality of elders, often has outweighted influence. And the people who can be attracted to that context can easily find themselves caught up in the narrative that they are creating the church plant like no other. This is unlike any church plant there's ever been before. Revival is just about to break out because of what we are doing here. Now, one of the most dangerous things that can happen within the church is to have a skilled, charismatic leader whose character and godliness is sorely lacking. So when we ask the question, do I have what it takes? The first question we want answered is not about charisma. It's not about competency. It's not about a crowd that someone can draw, but about their character and their convictions. Which is why Paul writes this to Timothy, doesn't he? In 2 Timothy 1:13 and 14. He says, what you heard from me, keep as the pattern of sound teaching with faith and love, guard the good deposit that was entrusted to you, guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit. 2 Timothy 2, 1 to 3. You then, my son, be strong in what? In the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. Join with me in suffering like a good soldier. First and foremost, Paul is interested in the character and the convictions of Timothy, so he holds on to this message of godliness and gospel and does not deviate. Not competencies, although those comments are present as you keep reading at points, but that's not where he starts. And so I would say, if you're interested in church planting and you hear the question, do I have what it takes? And your first assessment is based on your personality type or your competencies or your charisma, you have severely miscalculated what God is calling you to. But can I say this? This is the second reason. This is such a dangerous question for those who hear it. Is for many, hearing this question confirms everything they think they know about church planters. And this could be dangerous from the perspective of someone thinking that if they needed to plant a church, they would need to be that kind of highly charismatic leader, entrepreneurial leader, and therefore they would rule themselves out of ever considering church planting. Or it could be that you have been so burnt by people like this church planter caricature or in these church plants, people who have led with such narcissistic tendencies that your reaction to that is we are much better off putting church planting aside and just focusing on revitalising the existing and established church. Church planting is unnecessary, unwanted, borderline ungodly. So, as we come to this question, it may be that we do need to clear the decks in order to actually hear what's helpful about the question. So, can I put to you how the question could be helpfully framed, just briefly, and then I'll unpack the implications of that. First, as mentioned previously, the very first question we want to ask ourselves when it comes to church planting is this: what is my motivation? Who is this endeavour for? Now, our motivations are always going to be mixed, but the very first point of disqualification for church planting or any type of ministry for that matter is this: am I in this for me? Is this about me? That's not restricted to church planting. Can I say that question? Any ministry. We're talking about church planting here. And in church plants, the underlying truths around these questions and the answers to them very quickly emerge in the first few years. So the question, do I have what it takes? It needs to be reframed. It needs to be understood first and foremost, not in the light of me, but of God and His gospel. I'm going to return to that at the end. But that's the beginning of answering this question, do I have what it takes? Who is this about? But a distant second question to that, and it is a distant second, but it is a second question that needs to be asked, are the considerations around church planting competencies, leadership competencies, pragmatic considerations that cannot be ignored in any kind of leadership, and including church planting? And this is where I want to spend some time in this talk, because for any number of reasons, most people have a skewed picture of church planting and church planters, and it impacts the work of the gospel when they do. Not just for them, but for the local church and for the wider church. Because here's the reality. The reality that we have seen in the 100 plus church plants across the network in the last 10, 11 years, and the hundreds of conversations I've had with apprentices and college students and people in ministry, the reality is that not all church plants are the same, and therefore not all church planters are the same either. That's what we see in the network. That's what we see with our church planters. Now, let me explore that just a little bit by talking about church planting models, because it might seem obvious this. But I think what we see as we talk to people is they're stuck in one model of planting. It's where we need to broaden our horizons a little bit. So let me talk about church planting models a little bit. The model, as we've spoken about today, of most people are familiar with church planting, and that they default to in thinking about is this pioneer parachute planting model. That is, the planting couple, they'll have a location in mind or a subculture, people that has little gospel witness, and they'll move there with few people, few resources, but a clean slate to work out how it is they're going to reach those people. Start a new kind of gospel community and a church out of that. This is the model where the garage, the dog and the wife story comes from. It's a high-risk model. High-risk model. And yes, it does take a particular type of leader to do that. Now, most leaders assess their competencies for church planting based on that one model right there. But if you look at this chart that you can see on the screen right now, you'll see that over the years of church planting throughout the Geneva Push network, this is across denominations, across Australia, this type of model, this parachute pioneer planting, is not even the most common anymore. Not even the most common. Let me give you two other more common examples you can see on here. The first is the mother-daughter plan. This model takes a core group from Ascending Church, maybe 30, 40 people, and it begins in a new location with that core group, with the intent that they will generally become warmly independent of the sending church within a period of time, or when they become self-sustaining. Now, this model isn't nearly as high risk as a parachute plan because of the larger launch team, but the difference between this and the model we'll talk about in a moment is they are heading towards independence. Now, it doesn't take a lesser leader to do this model, it just takes a different kind of leader to do this model. But if we looked at the another model, what's called the multi-site model. Now, don't hear when you hear multi-site, beamed in, preaching. No, these are live campuses, live leadership. And the key difference here is around the ongoing relationship between the sending church and the sent church. They launch as part of the sending church, and the infrastructure that's put in place is built to leverage and reinforce that strength. One church, but multiple locations. That is, the multi-site uses a hub and spoke model to leverage infrastructure for the good of the church of the whole. You don't have to reinvent the wheel with all the administration, but it allows the plant, the campus, whatever you want to call it, to focus on the mission that they are being sent, the people they're being sent to reach. Now, multi-site models are low risk, but they take significant preparation and they take significant intentionality before rolling out and while rolling out. And again, it's not a lesser type of leader that leads those. It's just a different type of leader. So let me unpack that a little bit. You've got these three models of planting, and you can see that even between these three models, how it reframes the questions of competencies for a church planter. And it reframes that question of, do I have what it takes, when you're thinking about pragmatics? Because in every ministry role, we're looking for godly character, deep gospel convictions, the biblical characteristics of an elder being displayed. But for particular roles and models of church planting, on top of that foundation, we are working to identify the right leader for the right context. And what we've seen is that where this is not done intentionally, it nearly always becomes complicated and messy. You're probably way ahead of me here, but let me explore this a little bit, and you'll see why it's so important for both the sending church and the potential planter to do this. So let's compare two models that we've seen, the parachute pioneer plan and the multi-site model. You're way ahead of me here, I know, but just stay with me, come back to me, and we'll see how this fits together. Now, if you've got a leader who's more wired towards a parachute plant here, highly entrepreneurial, has new ideas, they're waiting to constantly implement these things, they're often critiquing what's happening in the wider work, and they express a desire constantly to do things differently. If you place them within a multi-site model of church, it'll cause rising tension. Because at the heart of a multi-site model is the rolling out of an agreed ministry philosophy, an agreed DNA from the sending church. So the kind of leader that you're looking for is someone who thinks that the DNA of the church they're being sent from is worth replicating. They are sold out for the larger vision of that church. They're not a clone. They will contextualize slightly, but they're so sold out for this ministry model. And that leader will be organisationally gifted, and they'll be a mediator because they will be straddling two worlds. The church they're leading over here, which is part of a larger church over here. And they will constantly be battling the tension and managing those two worlds so they don't become separate but stay together. Now, in that environment, a parachute planter would eventually crack from frustration because their wiring is to do things differently. Their desire is often to try something new, but in a multi-site environment, that will create tension and conflict. One leader isn't better than the other, they're just different. And so you can begin to see then why the model of church planting impacts the type of leadership characteristics you might be looking for. When done thoughtfully, when done intentionally, we are seeing it lead to different kinds of church planters, people who might not ever before have seen themselves planting. But we're seeing them planting in such a way that they are planting thriving, healthy, evangelistic churches that are reaching the lost. So just as I draw this to a close, let me come back to this question of, do I have what it takes? And can I speak to three different audiences for a moment? Three different audiences as I wrap this up. First, to those who have a heart for reaching the lost and who have been holding church planting at arm's length because you didn't think you were that kind of person, this is to you. So we've seen different planting models do require different type of leadership competencies. But there are some things that are consistent across all church planters, no matter the model. One, they all have the heart of an evangelist. They all have the heart of an evangelist. They may not be an amazing evangelist themselves, but it weighs heavily on them that so many people will face eternity without Jesus, and they feel compelled to do something about that. Two, they can cast a gospel vision that captures people, that's biblical, it's compelling, captures and mobilises people around that. Three, they have an ability to cope with and navigate ambiguity and uncertainty within this. There's no certainty in church planting. It doesn't matter the model. There's no certainty. We can and we do work to alleviate all number of aspects as we train and we deploy and we support church planters across the country. But church planting is inherently risky. See, these traits, being an evangelist, being able to cast a biblical vision, and being able to cope with ambiguity, now they aren't traits that are exclusive to church planters, but it is what we're seeing run through all the church planters that we deal with. So can I say, if that describes you, it is worth asking why you shouldn't take the next step and ask the question about exploring church planting. One of the tools we use to help people in this conversation, we're making available to any conference delegates for the next 48 hours. You can see the link on the bottom of the screen. I'm sure that will come up again. It's our church planter assessment tool, and you can find it at genevapush.com/CPAT. And the tool has two sections. One, it pushes into biblical characteristics for gospel workers. This is just true of anyone in ministry. This is a foundation for anyone who wants to plant a church, lead a ministry, doesn't matter. That's the first section. But the second section begins to explore some of these different leadership competencies that are associated with church planting models. Now, you can take this test for free for the next 48 hours, and you'll get a follow-up email with the report. And if you want to touch base with us and talk about it, you can do that. But my encouragement is this. If you have ruled out church planting prior to this, if you've kept it at arm's length, can I say, ask the question, at the very least, ask the question. See where it leads. Church planting is not a high calling. It's not the only calling, but within the mission field that we face across Australia, it is absolutely necessary that we find the next generation of planters, young and old, alongside those who will lead established churches. Here's a second audience I want to talk to tonight, because there's another group of people I want to challenge as well. If you're an elder or you're a leader in your local church, amidst all the challenges that ministry throws up and the relentless grind that it can sometimes feel like ministry is, can I ask you to pause for a moment? Just ask a couple of questions. If someone was to ask you today, where would you plant a church? Can I ask, would you have an answer to that question? Where would you plant a church? Would you have an answer? And if someone was to ask you today, in the local church and ministry that you lead, who you are investing in now, who do you spend time building during the week and praying about that you will eventually send to lead or plant? Would you have an answer to that question? And the challenges of local ministry, it is never easy to ask these questions. So many other things crowd in. But we must. When was the last time you prayed towards those ends? Recalibrated your diary so that you had time to do those things? Recast the vision of your church so you could push towards those goals? The local church is the incubator of church leadership. The local church is where God is maturing and raising up the next generation of gospel leaders and planters. We cannot buy leaders forever. We must build them under God. The local church is the incubator of those future leaders. And if we who are leaders in the church do not have time to invest in them, who will? Where will they go to? If we do not have the heart to cast a vision compelling enough to capture Matthew 28 for them to give their lives to change people's eternity, if we do not have the heart to cast that vision, then who will? Lastly, here's the third audience. As a denomination, can I encourage you that we cannot stop planting? We cannot stop planting. It's not the only thing we must do. Denominations are complex organisations, and I know firsthand from the context of that I'm in, the Queensland Prezzies, there are many distractions. There are many things which need our attention. But I'm convinced, because I've seen it and I've experienced it, that where there is no room or vision for church planting, amongst revitalising churches and amongst nurturing church health, when church planting gets taken off the table, the whole church is poorer for it. I've seen it across Australia. If under God, you are going to see the next generation of leaders captured by a vision as big as the Great Commission, you are going to need to show them that there is room for different type of leaders in this denomination, alongside those who are wired and inclined, as we need to, alongside those who are wired and inclined towards leading the established church. The question of church planting is not an either or, it's a both and. It has to be. Mission field is so vast. The challenge is so great. The cost for being short-sighted with this is just too costly to contemplate. We must have both. We must have both the commitment and the imagination to see how God could both resurrect churches from the dead and give birth to new ones. Ultimately, this is God's church. He will bring about his will. question of do I have what it takes, it's a two-edged sword. Of course I have what it takes. I have been entrusted with the gospel of grace that brings life where there is death and hope where there is despair. Of course I have what it takes, but that is not located in me. That's located in God. The other side of the question might be a little sharper for us. What under God will I do with that which has been entrusted to me? The gospel that brings life, the experience I've built in God's church, under God's guidance, in my context, the way He has wired me, the context I find myself in. What will I do? See, that question cuts a little bit deeper as it should. Am I willing to do whatever it takes in this state to see those who are lost hear and respond to that same message of grace that I have been fortunate enough to hear and God not turn and soften my heart to? Am I willing to go if I'm called? I'm praying you are.